Hi everyone. In this week's module, we're going to explore the two-point perspective system in more depth. Specifically, let's talk about the different ways that we can create proportion in our perspective views. We've already covered the additive and subtractive form and how to use the perspective grid with one-point perspective. We'll take a look at them in the two-point perspective system and finally go into a lot more detail about a much more technical method of drawing to scale or to proportion in a two-point perspective. It's called the common or sometimes called the office method. As a reminder, you can use additive and subtractive forms to guide the proportion and development of your parts. And here's an example of how that worked in one-point perspective. Starting on the left, we used additive forms, these different box shapes to kind of outline our chair form, and then used subtractive forms to carve away at everything we didn't need and create the details of this chair. Now, here's what the same process might look like in two-point perspective system. On the top here, we've used additive forms to create these boxes and really outline our chair. And on the bottom, then we have used a subtractive forms to carve away all the material that we don't need and give our chair some detail. Let's look at another example. Here we have created a box as our basic form and then carved away at it and used subtractive techniques to create our little table here. This one is an example of both additive and subtractive forms. On the top, we start with a basic rectangular prism. All right, and then use the dividing technique to mark the locations of these shelves. And then moving to the second or the bottom image, look how we've carved away the inside of that bookcase, kind of made it empty. And also, so that's subtractive, and also we've added forms to the top and bottom of this bookcase, kind of a base and a cornice at the top to create the larger shape. Moving on to the next technique, a perspective grid. The grid is a visual tool for you as the designer to put the room or the space in perspective. And we've seen the one-point perspective grid there on the left, and you can also do this in two-point perspective. First, let's review this one-point perspective interior grid. Remember that each block on the grid represents one unit, and the rear wall elevation that's looking directly at us can be drawn to a specific architectural scale. As the blocks move forward into the foreground, they get larger. As you move back into the rear of the room, they get smaller. Because it's a one-point perspective grid, you will have true vertical lines, true horizontal lines, and then everything else is going to recede towards that single vanishing point. The one-point perspective grid is really common for interior views of an interior room, but it can also be used for exterior views. For example, a streetscape is a common example. But this week we're studying two-point perspective system, right? So what does that two-point perspective grid look like? Here it is. Just like the one-point perspective, each block on your grid is going to represent one unit. But remember the one point you had a back wall that was directly orthogonal to the viewer. In the two-point perspective, that's not true. Instead, we're looking at a corner or an edge. Take a look, it's right here. Right. And that rear wall corner can be drawn and measured to an architectural scale. Nothing else in the room is measured to an architectural scale. You would measure them off of the grid. The blocks get larger as they move to the foreground and smaller as they recede towards the back of the room. Notice on the 2-point perspective grid, we have true vertical lines, but no true horizontal lines. All right, everything else is perspective lines, and they will vanish to either the right or the left vanishing point. 2-point perspective grids are very commonly used for interior views, but they can also be used for exterior views. And here's an example here on the right. Go ahead and pause and look very closely. You can see the faint blue grid lines on this image. All right, everybody, in this video, we did a review of the different ways that you can create proportion and scale in a 2-point perspective drawing and introduced you a little bit to that 2-point perspective grid. In the next video, we're going to continue talking about scale, but go into much more detail in the common or office method of constructing a 2-point perspective drawing. Thanks, everyone.